Hello, and welcome to the podcast's Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond. We explore historical and spiritual questions about Jesus, gender, women, salvation, healing, and the meaning of life. Shirley Paulson is hosting a series of conversations with scholars who are able to unlock mysteries from extra-canonical books, forgotten scriptures, so-called Gnostic Gospels, and the Bible. And for those of you who love our Bible and Beyond podcasts, would you please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page? Go to patreon.com/Bible and Beyond to join at any level just right for you. And now, here's Shirley Paulson.
I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Jason BeDuhn, who back to the Bible and Beyond podcast. And I want to thank you so much for being with us again, Jason. There are lots of really interesting things I could tell about Jason in my introduction here, but I'll stick to the things that pertain mostly to our conversation today. First, I should say he's a professor of comparative study of religions and Asian studies at Northern Arizona University. He's editor of the Hammadi and Manichaean Studies with Brill Publishers, and he's co-chair of Westar Institute's Christianity Seminar 2. It's also important to say he's a Guggenheim Fellow, a National Humanities Center Fellow, and he's won the American Academy of Religion Best First Book Award for the Manichaean Body in 2000. This is our second podcast during this second month focus on the surprising things about Jesus. And so I really want to ask you, Jason, if you talk to us about what the Manichaeans might help us to know about Jesus, that might surprise us. So welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
There are all kinds of reasons for why people turn in some directions and not others for their trusted sources. And I think Manichaeism is a fascinating subject for this conversation because on the one hand, it's commonly thought of as an outlier, something that is not quite right about it. And yet, on the other hand, we've been learning in our studies of ancient texts that some of these categories tend to shut the door before we've had a chance to listen. So the fact is that Manichaeism considers itself quite close to the Jesus movements. Its views of Jesus can help us understand how people viewed or remembered Jesus in ways we may never have considered. So, and Mani wasn't even a lone preacher out in the wilderness. He led a major religion to his views. So why don't we start with who Mani was? Was he a real person? And what do you know about him?
Well, we know that he was born in 216 of the Christian era. Later legend says that he was descended from Iranian royalty. We're not sure about that. What we do know for sure is that he grew up in a Mesopotamian sectarian community called the Elkosites. Now, the Elkosites are usually lumped in that group called Jewish Christianity. They were Jewish believers in Jesus. And from the time he was a very young child, he was raised in this community. Whether he was of Jewish or Iranian ancestry, we really don't know. But as he grew up, he started to have mystical experiences, revelations, and eventually he went out on his own with just a handful of companions from that community, and they then developed a new religious community, which was called many things, but primarily the Holy Church, or the Holy Community, as a kind of reformed expression of the Jesus movement. And after about 30 years of developing this community and winning converts and traveling all around Iran and what's now Iraq and some parts of Syria and India, Armenia, places like that, he finally was arrested by the Iranian government and he died in prison. Would have been in his early 60s by then. So he had about 30 years of activity before his end.
Well, so that's helpful to get a little historical and geographical context for where he is or was. But I'm a little curious about how he got to know what he was having these revelations about. Like, if there wasn't any Bible around for him to read, how did he learn what he learned about Jesus? And did he run into any of the other apostles, or how did he get it?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. We know very little about the transmission of the Jesus movement to the east of Judea and Galilee, right? We know a lot about its transmission to the west with Paul and other apostles throughout the Roman Empire. We know a lot about that, but the earliest transmission of Jesus' teachings and Jesus' stories and the Jesus movement to across the Roman border into what was then Iranian-controlled territory in what's now Iran and Iraq, we know very little about that, how early that started, in what form it took. But it's quite sensible that it went that way as well, because there were many Jews living in Mesopotamia at the time. The book of Acts talks about Jews coming to Jerusalem on pilgrimage from places to the east. So we know that there was some contact. So naturally, then, the Jesus movement followed those lines of contact within the larger Jewish diaspora. So since Mani grew up in one of these communities that was Jewish but had been exposed to Jesus' teachings, he learned primarily through oral transmission of Jesus' traditions, what Jesus said, what Jesus did. He also seemed to have had access to, at least at some point in his life, he had access to a gospel harmony, writing of the story of Jesus that was taken from existing gospel accounts and put into a single narrative. And this is called the Diatessaron. It was a very popular and important version of the life of Jesus in West Asia for several centuries. It was more widely used than what we now know as the canonical Gospels. And so the Diatessaron then is a version of the life of Jesus that has almost all the details we find in the canonical Gospels, but put together in a single harmonized narrative in which all the events are contained in a single story. And Mani certainly had access to that at some point. And so between the oral traditions he was exposed to and written sources like the Diatessaron, he was as well versed as anyone could be in that material before we start to get the Bible being put together by Christians.
So that's interesting. So would you consider him then to be more literate than the apostles might have been?
He was very literate. He emphasized writing as a way to preserve teachings from being changed. So if we think about the first couple of centuries of Christianity, there's a kind of tug of war going on between a primarily oral culture, which, as you say, the first disciples of Jesus were mostly illiterate people. So naturally, they worked in an oral environment and transmitted things from memory and repetition. And then writing culture, which gradually takes hold in the Christian movement, in the Jesus movements. And Mani seems to have been educated. He knew how to read and write. He took an existing script from his part of the world and modified it a little bit and made his own distinctive, what's called Manichaean script writing. And in his teachings, he emphasized that the fluidity of oral traditions is dangerous because people can sort of make up whatever they want. So that if you write things down, that's something you can then check teachings against a written version. So he clearly was in that movement that also led in other forms of Christianity to the creation of a Bible. But he was wanting to write down Jesus' traditions and other teachings, and as well as his own revelations, and write those down so that subsequent generations of his followers would know what it is he had said without any possibility of it being tampered with. At least he had hoped.
Well, that's so fascinating that you're talking about his desire to use writing as a tool for keeping things the way they're supposed to be, and yet he's the one who also made his own interpretations. So he was taking liberties, but also wanting to preserve whatever was accurate. That's kind of an interesting dichotomy there, maybe. So another thing I want to be clear about here is that you're saying that he was living during the time before the Nicene Council, so which is such a historical important event in terms of identifying what's Christian, what's not Christian. So would you say that he was like wanting to be known as a Jesus follower? Or was he wanting to connect with other Jesus followers because he was reading these certain texts? or how did he identify with what was not yet termed Christian?
Yeah, he very much believed that he was aware that there was a variety of forms of the Jesus movements, and he believed that his direct revelations from God told him which ones were right and which ones were wrong. And
Okay.
therefore, he was kind of a reformer. As ironic as it sounds, so early
Yeah.
in the development of the Jesus movement, he saw himself as a reformer of a tradition that was already going astray, precisely because Jesus was gone. His disciples were relied upon to transmit the teachings accurately. He believed they might have been, influenced by other things, and that his ability to receive revelations directly from God, much in the way that Paul had, allowed him to correct what might have gone wrong. So he did see himself as a necessary reformer, and also someone who would help sort of explain and fill in the gaps between the things that Jesus taught. So
Wow.
very early in among his followers, he came to be believed to be the Paraclete, the one that Jesus had predicted that, in the Gospel of John, Jesus says, well, I have to go, and I haven't had time to teach you everything, but one will come after me who will fill that in for you and give you the rest. And there were many parts of the Jesus movement that thought that their leader or their founder was that individual. And the Manichaeans were among those who thought that Mani was that predicted paraclete and that he was there to give the complete teachings of which Jesus had only given the beginnings.
Oh, that's rather fascinating. Okay, so did he think of himself as competing with other paracletes, or he was the only one known to have identified himself as a paraclete at that time?
We don't have him directly making the claim for himself.
Oh, okay.
He claims that Jesus that he called himself the apostle of Jesus Christ.
Okay.
He signed his letters that way, Mani, the apostle of Jesus Christ. He had a seal with which he sealed the letters for authenticity, like was the
Mm.
normal practice at the time. And that seal, made out of crystal, actually survives. And it's the only actual artifact of Mani's life that survives. It was found at some point in the 19th century in Iraq and is now in Paris, in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. And it has a portrait of him and two of his followers, and then around the perimeter it says Mani, the apostle of Jesus Christ, and he would use that seal then to stamp his letters. So that's how he characterized himself, as an apostle. His followers then said, okay, now what is his role? What is his place in this
Mhm.
tradition?
Mhm.
And that's where they brought in this prophecy of the Paraclete as one that would explain the kind of role that he was playing for them.
So if he was so closely identifying himself with Jesus and being an apostle of Jesus, why now in history are we not seeing the Manichaeans as central to Christianity? What happened?
Well, he certainly saw himself as not only teaching Christianity, but the Christianity.
Yeah. So, but it
So
didn't
what
happen.
happens historically? What happens historically is you have competition.
Yeah.
You have competition of different leaders who think that they're the ones who are teaching the correct version, and there's a war of words naturally between these different groups that says, no, we're right, you're wrong.
Yeah.
And then, as happens in history, one of those groups gets access to power. And once they get access to power, the temptation is great to use it against one's rivals and one's
Yeah.
opponents. And so, in early on, other forms of Christianity got that power, and Manichaeans didn't. And so, Manichaeans were persecuted for a long time in many parts of the world. Eventually, they had their own brief window of power in Central Asia for a couple centuries, but for the most of their history, they did not, and therefore the victorious form of Christianity did its utmost to destroy Manichaeism, to burn its texts, and therefore Manichaeism ultimately became extinct.
That's rather fascinating story right there. Oh my goodness. So then why don't you tell us what's at the heart of his teaching? Then what's different about it from what has become known as maybe orthodoxy?
Okay. Well, the fundamental core of Mani's teaching is that life and existence is a struggle between good and evil. And this is not so unusual in world religions, right? Think about it. Why do we
Right,
need religion?
right.
Because things are not okay just as they are. Something's not quite right, and we need to do something about it. We either need to change ourselves or change the world. Something of that nature is what religion is usually all about. So Mani taught that good and evil is in everything in the world and everything we experience. And so it's up to us to discern the difference, to know what is good and what is evil, and to structure our own lives and our own behavior according to that discernment. So whenever we experience something, we know how to react to it. Whenever we get a thought or an impulse within ourselves, we scrutinize it. Is this a good impulse or a bad impulse? Will this lead to good things or will this lead to bad things? So, since everything in the universe has both good and evil in it, the primary function of religion is to discern the difference, separate them, make sure that we are aligning ourselves with the side of good in all things we do. And that will lead to the ultimate separation of good from evil, so that we will no longer experience this unsatisfactory mixture of the two, and we will move into an existence in which it's only good that we experience. That's the core of the Manichaean teaching.
Well, okay, that's sounds pretty palatable. I think that's a helpful way to uh, um, get your hands around why it's valuable, why people would want to follow that. Then, I would say a lot of modern Christians like to tell the story of Jesus from beginning to end by putting together lots of different sources. And we've been discussing with several scholars in our podcast why that doesn't work very well.
Mhm.
But is that how Mani like to understand Jesus too? I mean, this idea of good and evil seems like it fits everybody. And I'm trying to understand what's different then?
Right. That's a terrific question. So Mani, as I said, had exposure to both oral tradition and written versions of the life of Jesus, and he seemed to pretty much accept those stories that had been transmitted to him and passed down to him. His contribution was to interpret them in light of this paradigm of good and evil. And so it's obviously very easy to see in the teachings of Jesus, teachings like this, that one should do the good and not the evil, that the world clearly has evil in it, and we need to deal with that. Um, but Mani also saw the life of Jesus himself as a kind of illustration of this struggle. That when Jesus had opponents and enemies and challenges, it was that confrontation of good and evil. And that when Jesus was arrested and brutalized and killed, that also reflects the struggle between good and evil. And how Jesus handled that final confrontation, then for Mani, captures the message he has for his followers, is that one of the ways you can distinguish good from evil is that good does not use violence.
Hmm.
So good inevitably suffers because it is on the receiving end of violence rather than the one causing violence. And therefore, we have to accept that if we are going to align with good, we are going to suffer. But our perseverance and our endurance and our demonstration of goodness in the face of evil, Mani believed would ultimately triumph. In some ways, you can compare it to the ideas of Gandhi that and Martin Luther King Jr., that you don't meet violence with violence, you meet it with goodness, and your hope and your plan is that that goodness will demonstrate itself and sort of prick the conscience of those doing violence against you and call out the traces of good within them so that they cease and desist. being
Wow.
bilingual.
So let me just understand here then. Am I hearing you right that you're saying that he was really more interested in pursuing this uh, authority of good and over evil, and that he used the stories of Jesus to sort of weave together to make his point? Was he more interested in that, or trying to follow Jesus, whatever Jesus was doing, or how did Jesus fit with his own vision for this then?
The revelations that Mani believed he was receiving matched what he saw in the stories of Jesus.
Okay.
And so we know we can play historical psychology and say which came first.
Right.
Did he have his ideas and fit them to Jesus, or was he a follower of Jesus first and
Yeah.
derived his ideas from there? That's always a dangerous game to play.
Right.
So because we don't know. But what we do know is that he saw complete consistency between what Jesus taught and how Jesus acted, and what he took to be the core message for the kind of values and way of life that followers of Jesus, in the way that Mani interpreted it, were on the right path.
Then when I hadn't realized that he ended up being persecuted himself like this, so he sort of lived out his own predictions then that goodness is going to be attacked because it's good and you don't fight back. Is that how did he play out his life pretty much the way he envisioned it?
He did, and the people after he died, his followers very much told his life story in parallel
Mm.
to the life story of Jesus. That both of them went through the suffering, both of them died at the hands of their enemies, um, but there's that sort of uptick of hopefulness in it, right? So just as Jesus rose from the dead, so Mani transcended death. He ascended into heaven um, in his death,
Hmm.
and ultimately evil could not hold him.
So then, did he think of like resurrection as being for somebody like him who had the ultimate visions and was a paraclete, or was this something that he thought that everybody would ultimately have by following him? Or what did he think of his followers then?
Yeah, it was a path that he very much believed that all of his followers would attain, that they equally would transcend death, um, that good and evil that is mixed in people. Um, what dies, what is cast off in death, is the evil part, and what transcends death is the good part. And therefore, he didn't believe in a physical resurrection. He believed in a spiritual ascension, um, and he believed that ultimately everyone would achieve this. So Mani believed in reincarnation.
Okay.
And so he believed that even if someone in this life doesn't make it, if someone in this life is overpowered by the evil within them and lead bad lives, ultimately, given enough time, they will evolve and reach a point where they can be saved.
Okay. So then you're starting to talk a little bit about things that are moving off the orthodox position of things, which
Sure.
leads me to my next question, really, which has to do with um, the relationship with the Nag Hammadi world. You know, we've often discussed the text that came to light from Nag Hammadi that has changed our views of the period of time between Jesus and Nicaea.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that there's any kind of meaningful connection between Mani and some of these writings, or how does he fit into that world?
Well, we do have some Manichaean texts in which Mani is talking and he's quoting sayings of Jesus, and we wouldn't know where these quotes were come from if we hadn't discovered the Gospel of Thomas among the Nag Hammadi writings.
Okay.
So that tells us that he knows those traditions. Whether he knows the Gospel of Thomas, very possible, but at least he knows the same Jesus sayings that are in the Gospel of Thomas, or some of
Huh.
them. And so that's part of that larger, oral tradition that he would have been exposed to, and possibly also in written form. So there are those connections. The Nag Hammadi writings um, were discovered in the 1940s. About 20 years earlier, a set of Manichaean writings were found in Egypt,
Hmm.
in a place called Medinet Madi. They're very similar to the Nag Hammadi text in terms of they're written in the same dialect of Coptic, which is ancient Egyptian, in Greek letters. It contains many parallel ideas, but the texts were not as well preserved. So we're still working on deciphering the Medinet Mahdi Manichaean library, whereas the Nag Hammadi library is pretty far along in terms of deciphering those texts. And so these two bodies of literature show how diverse early Christianity was in Egypt. They're both from about the 4th century, both collections. They both would have been hidden at around the same time when Orthodox Christianity was taking over and suppressing these alternate forms of the Jesus movements. And it's even possible, some have argued, that some of the Nag Hammadi texts seem to have Manichaean influence in them. So it goes both ways.
Yeah.
So the kind of groups that were producing the Nag Hammadi texts were not themselves Manichaeans, but they were in contact with Manichaeism and vice versa.
That's fascinating. All right. Now, so you're kind of tantalizing me here a little bit with different kinds of scrolls. I see some scrolls sitting behind you on your couch. Are those related to this, or are they just decoration?
They're just decoration. They're actually Japanese.
Oh, they're Japanese.
Scrolls
All
with
right.
a little bit of calligraphy and stuff on them. Just part of the mess of my office. But
All right. But do you work with the Manichaean? I mean, were they scrolls? What kinds of paper were they on?
so they're papyrus,
Okay.
and they're in codex form, just like the Nag Hammadi text. So
Okay.
both the Medinet Mahdi Manichaean library and the Nag Hammadi Gnostic library are codex collections. Both, as we said, hidden away when they had to be, when they were afraid of having them destroyed by hostile people. And if the person who hid them thought they would come back for them later, for some reason they never were able to.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm actually part of a project that's working on the Manichaean codices, trying to read them and decipher them, and using new techniques like multispectral imaging to read what otherwise is very hard to read in them.
Wow, it's really interesting. So were Mani's ideas controversial during his lifetime as much as they became later, or was it just now that Orthodoxy has established itself, we don't know much about Manichaeism?
Well, Mani adapted the Jesus movement to his own cultural environment.
Okay.
He would have been among the first to be preaching Jesus
Hmm.
in the part of the world where he lived, in Mesopotamia and Iran, within the first couple generations. And we actually have texts where he seems to be talking about Jesus to people who've never heard about Jesus before. And they ask him, well, what does this mean? And how does that relate to, say, Zoroaster? Or how does that relate to the Buddha? Because we've heard these teachings. And so Mani is actively comparing and correlating the teachings of Jesus to these other religious traditions in the environment he's in. So the kind of Christianity then that is formed in Manichaeism is adapted to a different cultural environment than the Greco-Roman West, where we get Orthodox and Catholic and later forms of Christianity. So naturally, there's going to be some differences in how they talk about these things. And then when they do come into contact, there's going to be friction over these different interpretations. So Mani sends missionaries west into the Roman Empire, and they come into contact with other forms of Christians there, and they enter into debate and argument. And then in various ways, Christians brought up in Greco-Roman forms of Christianity cross over into the Iranian-controlled territory, some voluntarily, some in being refugees in war. And then they begin to say, well, wait a minute, what you're doing here is different from what we were doing back in the Roman Empire in terms of how you're interpreting this. So they do get into conflicts. And so controversy then erupts very, very early
Yeah.
as these different developments of the Jesus movements come into contact with each other and begin to argue.
Okay. And so then maybe briefly you can give us a quick history, what happened between then and now, like what happened to Manichaeism after his lifetime.
Yeah. So what happened is that Manichaeism was a very active missionary movement. So it was a big part of its goal was to spread as far as possible. So Manichaean missionaries come into the Roman Empire. They spread into Egypt, North Africa, and other regions like that. Augustine of Hippo St. Augustine was a Manichaean for about a dozen years before he became a Catholic, and I've written about that. And then it also spread east. So Mani himself visited India and then sent other missionaries to follow him into India. Manichaeism spreads into Central Asia and China. Um, in some parts of Central Asia and China, the Manichaeans are the first form of Christianity that they're exposed to.
Hmm.
And in fact, the only pre-modern depictions of Jesus from Central and East Asia are Manichaean depictions of Jesus. And so we have Manichaean works of art from Central Asia and China that show Jesus as the Manichaeans envisioned him, of course, adapted to local artistic traditions of how to do that. And there was a brief window of a couple hundred years where a state actually adopted Manichaeism as its official religion, and that was the Uyghur, a couple successive Uyghur states in Central Asia, first a large steppe empire, and then later successor Uyghur states after that. And many of our audience will have heard of the Uyghurs more recently in unfortunate circumstances. They're mostly Muslims now, and for the most part, they're under really hard conditions in the People's Republic of China now because of a perceived, separatist kind of attitudes among the Uyghurs and not wanting to totally conform to PRC culture and attitudes. But the Uyghurs for a while were Manichaeans before they later convert to mostly to Islam. And so the last vestiges of Manichaeism that we know about are in southern China. And there are actually works of art from there. There's actually a Manichaean temple that survives and now is a UNESCO World Heritage Site in southern China with a big statue of Mani in it and so forth. But they seem to die out maybe in the 16 or 1700s.
Really that long? That's interesting.
They hold
Well,
on for a long time.
yeah. So our theme for these 2 months on the Bible and Beyond has been the surprising things about Jesus, and you've already told us some surprising things here about all this. How would you summarize the most surprising thing that we can learn from Jesus? Learn about Jesus, I mean, from Manichaeism.
So you mentioned earlier the Council of Nicea.
Yeah.
And the Council of Nicea is famous for the moment when the Christians who were gathered at that council declared that Jesus had the same nature as God. And they actually use this technical Greek word homoousios, having the same essence or same nature. That word was actually a Manichaean word that was borrowed by the council to deliberately push out other forms of Christianity that had pointed out that the group that was gathered in Nicaea was edging towards what they considered Manichaean views. So, people in your audience will have heard of Arius and the Arians. So Arius had said to opponents in the lead up to Nicaea, when you start talking this way, you're talking in a Manichaean way, because the Manichaeans say that Jesus is of the same nature as God, where we believe Jesus was a created being, like everything else besides God. And so the council seems to have deliberately adopted this word to say to Arius, "You're out," right? We're gonna adopt language that you could not possibly accept, because we know you've already told us that this kind of language is unacceptable. The catch to all this is that Manichaeans didn't just say that Jesus was of the same nature of God. They said that all human beings are of the same nature as God. In fact, all living things, all plants, all animals are homoousios, are of the same nature as God. That divinity equals goodness, and that pervades the whole universe. It's in everything that we might encounter. It's in every one, every creature. We're all of one nature, and it's of a divine nature. And so Manichaeans would talk, for example, when they talk about the crucifixion of Jesus, they'll say Jesus hangs on every tree, right? So we have to be conscious of how we interact with our fellow human beings, with nature itself, because of the divine presence in it. So we have to be very careful. We regulate our behavior, not be aggressive, not be violent, not be try to manipulate and exploit other things around us. And that then is a key to understanding what the Manichaeans are teaching about how we relate to Jesus, and how the life and teaching of Jesus help us understand how we relate to others. So, for example, the Manichaeans point to the Last Judgment scene, which most of us know from the Gospel of Matthew, in which Jesus says, if there was someone who was poor, if there was someone who was hungry, if there was someone who was homeless, and you did good things for them, it's like you did it for me. And the Manichaeans say, yes, exactly, because the same nature, the same essence is in all beings. And so you have to be conscious about how you're treating those things. So they'll talk about even walking on the grass. The grass itself has divinity in it, so you have to be very self-conscious about that and think about, is it worth me doing this? Is the harm I'm causing by my very steps for a good cause? Or am I just too lazy to stay on the sidewalk, right? What's motivating my relation to other things? But it also includes the fact, of course, that divinity then does suffer. And a lot of the interests of Orthodox Christianity that was inherited by Catholic Church and Protestant churches was this Chalcedonian separation of the divine Son who can't suffer and the human Jesus who can. And Manichaeans say, no, it's all one. Divinity does suffer. If Jesus suffered, his divinity also suffered. So they don't understand divinity as immune to these kinds of experiences. So we can't think of it as something that is untouchable. It is something that is very vulnerable. We have a Latin writing Manichaean talk about the vulnerable Jesus in all things. And so that awareness then heightens the significance of how we act in the world. Now, so that tells all the things that the Manichaeans say that kind of lifts us up and thinks of us all, we're all divine. We all have this. But of course, Manichaeans also teach that there's evil in everything. There's evil in us.
Okay.
And that's why we can't get ahead of ourselves and say, oh, I'm divine. I can do no wrong. No, I can do wrong because evil is in there too. So whenever I get an idea or an impulse, I need to check which part of me is that coming from, and how is that going to shape how I react to it and how I deal with it. So Manichaeism had this very unique way of drawing together these different aspects of the teachings of Jesus and about Jesus and fitting it to this larger worldview, and also suggesting that Jesus was not unique, that if we look closely at Buddhism or Zoroastrianism or these other traditions, we will find that they too were messengers of God and they brought very similar teachings. And that's one of the reasons people might say, well, is Manichaeism really Christianity if it's open to these other religions? But the Manichaeans taught, in some ways like Unitarians, that all of these are messengers from God. They all belong together as part of sort of the divine message to humanity.
Oh my goodness, that's a surprise, all right. Thank you so much, Jason. So I'm very intrigued with the idea that the Manichaeans are teaching us to think about good and evil as the main point, not just arguing over doctrinal things, but then, of course, how does it get played out and where the competition is, but mainly the surprise about thinking of Jesus in a kind of a whole new big way that's important for us to know. Thank you so much for being with us. This has been just a fascinating conversation. I knew it would be, but I really appreciate this. Thank you so much.
I'm so glad to be part of this larger conversation you're having.
Thank you.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us today. Be sure to check out the details from this episode from the show notes on the website earlychristiantexts.com, or just come browse around on the website to find all the other resources provided for you there. Also, we ask for your support to keep producing these podcast interviews. Please consider becoming a supporting member of our Patreon page at patreon.com/BibleandBeyond. And we love hearing from you on the Facebook page at Early Christian Texts or Twitter at EarlyXIAN Texts. Be sure to come back next month for our next episode on Early Christian Texts, the Bible, and Beyond.